Our first speaker is Dr. Al Smith from Michigan State University. If you'll please join me in welcoming Al.
Well, thanks very much. I'm extremely honored to have the opportunity to present to you today and join Bill and Thelma in this session. I want to extend my thanks to Debbie Rose for that invitation, so thank you very much. And she wisely counseled me not to title this Kids Rule, Adults Drool, but that's kind of the main theme here. I'm going to try to build a bit of a case for us to maybe spend a little bit more time putting young people at the very center of our enterprise of trying to understand and promote physical activity behavior by focusing on peers. And so the roadmap today will be first to just speak a bit about where I'm coming from, and I'll do that through some definitions. And I'll share a bit with you on peers as motivational agents, what we know about that from the literature. And then I'll share a tad on motivational and relationship structures that we might be able to leverage in order to help us do a better job of promoting physical activity with young people. And then I'll share selected future research and practice considerations. So we have our definition of physical activity, and I know I should be adding sleep to this based on last night's talk, but approach physical activity very much from the large umbrella perspective. I spent a lot of my time studying youth sport context, but also physical education and other general physical activity contexts. And in addition, I'm very interested in physical activity not only as an end in itself, which I know is of course very important, but being someone who's interested in psychosocial processes, I view it as a wonderful laboratory for understanding motivated behavior, which is behavior oftentimes that must be effortful and is voluntary in nature. So when we think about motivation, there's really two frames of reference here that you'll see as we conduct work on this. One is, of course, physical activity, say, as an outcome variable. So when we're looking at the direction and intensity of our efforts, whether we approach or avoid activity, the types of activity we're attracted to, how much effort we put in, our persistence, et cetera, we're really looking at physical activity in that sense as an outcome. But we can also look at it, if you will, as an individual difference factor or a frame of reference factor, if you will. In other words, why is it that I'm there doing this? I could be engaging in physical activity, for example, for the inherent interest of it, which is the case for many young people, but I could also be doing it for all kinds of other reasons, maybe certain social motives, maybe because I want to be fit, or maybe there's rewards in it of some sort. So we look at motivation from both of those perspectives. And then also, I'll just comment briefly on how we define peer. In this work, it's most typically same age cohorts, so people in the same grade, people on the same team. And when we define this, we're thinking about individuals of equivalent social standing or power. So of course, when we compare adults to young people, then we think of young people collectively as peers. But we can also be more fine-grained about that if we choose. I'm not really talking about that today, but of course you can look at leaders or followers within teams, things like that. So there's other ways to kind of be more fine-grained about your examination of peers. And in fact, there are a variety of peer constructs that we can look at. We consider peer constructs relative to the broader peer group, so we can look at young people's peer networks. We can look at things like whether they're accepted by classmates or rejected and so forth. We can also look at specific peers. So here we're very interested maybe in, say, a particular friendship. And if I say Thelma is my friend, does she say the same thing? Is that reciprocated? What are characteristics of my friend? Do we have a good quality of relationship? And then also we have broader peer-referenced types of constructs such as social goals, self-presentational concerns, and so forth. So these are the various categories where we might pull peer constructs from. And I would say that in this literature, really, we've just scratched the surface. So, and I'll get into that here in a little bit. When we started this work, and I should credit Mo Weiss, who's here today. She was my doctoral advisor and very much kind of pushed me into this arena when I started my doctoral studies. We were looking generally at the literature to see, what kind of cases are out there for us spending time on this. And of course, one was that sport participation motivation literature from the 1980s, where there are kind of, if you will, I'll say three core motives for young people's involvement in sport activities. One of those, of course, is to have fun, right? So there's the affective side. Another is to develop competence or skills, right? And so you'll see that competence, of course, is central in a lot of motivational frameworks. And then the other is affiliation, or the desire to be with and regarded by others. So you see those three components in a lot of motivational frameworks. I'll share an example in a minute. But that's one reason we felt that it'd be worthwhile going down this path. Another reason was the data on preferred sources of competence information that Thelma Horn did much of this work. And this is where we take information in to gauge how competent we are or good at something. And when we feel we're good at something, that tends to motivate us to do that more. And what Thelma has found through her work is that as we move developmentally from childhood through adolescence, there are different sources of information that would be most salient. These are often important sources across the span, but certainly in childhood, adults are probably the primary source, and there are fewer sources that young people use then. But as we move into later childhood and early adolescence, peers ascend to be one of the most important, if not the most important, source of competence information for us. And that happens to correspond with a time frame when we start to see declines in physical activity behavior in young people. So to us, that was very important. And as I said, again, motivational frameworks often incorporate a social element. And here I use this particular one, but there are many other perspectives we could use to frame our work. But you see affect here, so there's your fun part. Here's your self-perception, so your sense of competence part. And then we see perceived social regard over here. That's your affiliation portion. And oftentimes the social element is exogenous to the rest of the model, suggesting that we might view that as a starting point, if you will, for intervention. And so it's not unusual for us to think of teachers, coaches, families, et cetera, as potential ways to approach physical activity problems. So there's two primary variables, I would say, that you see regularly in the physical activity, youth physical activity literature that have to do with peers. One is peer modeling, the other is peer support. Peer modeling is typically operationalized as physical activity of peers. We don't get too much more fine-grained in that and go into Bandura's entire theory on observational learning. So that's a proxy. And typically what we see is that physical activity of others positively associates with one's own physical activity. Having a higher number of active friends ties to a greater likelihood of meeting physical activity guidelines. And presence of friends can increase physical activity opportunity, motivation, and intensity. So practical implication is put kids with other active kids, right? Does that work for us? Well, probably, not entirely, right? And probably because there's a little bit more to that. We need to think about what the nature maybe of those connections are. Are they supportive connections? So we also look at peer support. And here we're interested in things like encouragement, providing assistance, co-participating, and other forms of helping. And what we know from the peer support work is that support positively associates with physical activity. That association persists through adolescence, even though we have a context of general decline in physical activity support. But again, I think there are important nuances here that possibly we might be missing. Because again, the support might not be wanted. There's some interesting work, for example, in the early 90s by Zarbatani that showed, helping is great in school, like when I want to get my homework done. But if you help me in the physical domain, you just showed everybody I'm incompetent, right? So that's not very good for me. And then is the supporter welcome? So I might not want a particular person to be supportive of me, right? Or I may not want to model a certain person. So these are considerations that led us to think more on exploring peer relationships, trying to get more at what's going on with the dyads and the closeness of those relationships with other peers. And so one area that we pursued with this early on was looking at what are the qualitative features, if you will, or dimensions of friendships in sport contexts. We looked at this across childhood and adolescence, and through qualitative inquiry and subsequent measurement efforts, we settled down on about 6 core dimensions, if you will, 5 of those positive dimensions that you see here, but also conflict. And I think it's important for us to keep in mind that peer relationships are in fact double-edged. We know that there is ample conflict, coerciveness, and victimization, even among friends and even on teams maybe that are very deliberately designed, but absolutely within physical education and other more general contexts. And this victimization can be based on things like weight status, physical capability, grooming, perceived sexual orientation, and so on. And what the literature tells us is that there are negative effects of this on physical activity with respect to throwing up barriers to physical activity, so those children might be excluded outright from physical activity opportunities, but also we know that there's a thwarting of the basic psychological needs of relatedness, competence, and autonomy, which are critical to downstream motivation-related outcomes. And then there's an undermining of the desire to participate altogether. So with that, a take-home is that we'll probably need, I think, to move beyond our literature at this point and the primary focus on modeling and support in our investigations and start to look at relationship constructs. So that's kind of where we continue forth, and because we thought those might help us gain some explanatory value as we look at physical activity behavior and the effectiveness of interventions. So what I want to do now is talk about peer motivational and relationship structures that might be considered as we move forward in this area. So as we consider how emerging knowledge on peers in physical activity settings can be translated to physical activity promotion efforts, the well-worn proverb here, birds of a feather flock together, absolutely comes to mind. If peers assemble in ways that are motivationally salient, and importantly, if that structure is expressed in a way that's malleable, then we possibly then have a pathway where we can pursue physical activity promotion. So I should point out, too, that the structure I speak of, or I will speak of here today, is more latent in nature, right? It's psychological. It's not necessarily overt, like the jock. We're all the jocks. We all hang out with each other, right? And you have the nerds and the goths, et cetera, at school. I'm not talking about those social categories. I'm talking about more psychological categories. So a first is peer motivational climate. This is a concept drawn from achievement goal perspectives. And the basic idea here is that the climate that surrounds us, as well as some of our predispositions, together can drive our involvement behavior, right? And what the climate is about is what is rewarded or reinforced by others in that setting. And we often look at this relative to, say, teachers or coaches. So what is it that's important to them? Are they interested in your development and learning, or are they more interested in kind of how you stack up, right? And that you're a great performer, right? So there's been some work done recently on peer motivational climate that suggests there are tasks involving climate features. These would be emphasis on improvement, relatedness, support, and effort, and also ego-involving climate features such as inter-team competition and ability. So in other words, how do we stack up when we're trying to elbow each other out for status and position in the group, and inter-team conflict. And what the literature shows is that peers are a unique source of these perceptions over and above the adults in the setting. And so they can be motivationally salient. And in fact, when we look at correlates of peer motivational climate, what we see are task-involving climate perceptions associate with a variety of adaptive motivation-related outcomes, including sport persistence, which is more of a behavioral index. Ego-involving climate tends to be negatively associated with those, and also tied with things like negative sport behaviors and burnout perceptions. So considered as a whole, this work suggests that the motivational climate reinforced by peers within the physical domain constitutes a social structure. And that's a structure that can be salient to the motivation and well-being of young people. Potential pathway for physical activity promotion would involve efforts to help young people value and reinforce among themselves balance of goals that's motivationally adaptive. And I think Glenn Roberts in his talk today will probably talk quite a bit about this relative to this conceptual perspective. Now, such a balance may be easier to accomplish with groups of young people when they perceive that their relationships with peers are supportive and affirming. So now we bring in the relationship side. So in addition to understanding the goals that tend to be reinforced, we want to understand how young people perceive their relationships. And as we thought about this, of course, we came back to the existing literature, and there's a few frustrations that, of course, we had with that. And so I give a brief example here. One common strategy in our literature is to look at a variety of social agents, say, and we assess the support we get from each of those agents, and we might then amalgamate them all together and say, well, that's our total support for physical activity, or that's our total modeling for activity. That obviously, we lose some information there, but also may not be most appropriate to amalgamate them. The other strategy we use is to not do that, but to run them in parallel, say, in a standard regression analysis, and we battle it out, and we see that today, mom's the winner. So mom predicts the most variance, and therefore we're going to focus on mom. And the problem is the next study you do, the teacher's most important. You're like, okay, wait, we're not going to focus on mom, we're going to focus on the teacher. And this becomes frustrating over time, of course. And again, it doesn't capture the collective set of relationships we might have. So the example I'll often give is, well, what if the teacher's telling me one thing and my parents are telling me another? What am I going to do? What if my peers are telling me one thing and other important social agents are giving a different message or a complementary one? What happens then? We're not really capturing that in these models. And we were doing the same thing in our own work early on. We'd look at various peer constructs, most typically peer acceptance, positive friendship quality, and friendship conflict. That's kind of rooted in some of Sullivan's work that suggests friends and peer acceptance are critical to youth with respect to various outcomes. And so we'd focus on those, but we'd always look at them in parallel, and we'd always see that peer acceptance was dominant. It bullied out friends, and we weren't ready to give up on friends yet. So what we did was we started to take a people-centered approach. And what that means is we're really looking instead for a taxonomy of individuals based on their set or the pattern of their scores on the respective variables. So in other words, we might find a profile of peer acceptance, positive friendship quality, and friendship conflict together that might characterize, say, the lone wolf. And we might have a different pattern that characterizes the social butterfly, and a different set that is tied to those who rule the roost, right, and so on, right? And maybe this could be infinite, in which case there isn't really social structure there that we can leverage. Alternatively, there might be a finite set that is helpful to us in some way. So a question we asked then was, do distinct constellations or profiles of peer relationships exist in physical activity settings? And are there then motivational implications of such profiles? So it's nice if I find lone wolves and social butterflies and all that, but if they don't differ in any meaningful way motivationally, then it's not going to help us down the line if we want to use that information for practice. So for our first effort on this, we looked at peer relationship profiles of sport campers, 10 to 14 years old, and we measured perceptions of peer acceptance and friendship quality, specifically positive friendship quality and friendship conflict. And what we did was we looked to see if we could profile individuals or create the taxonomy based on those constructs. And assuming that we would be successful, then we were going to compare those groups on the rest of these variables you see here, which are important motivation-related constructs. And so in that first step, what we're doing is a cluster analysis. And we had some issues with this slide before, but they look good now. That's great. I'm relieved. And the way we look at our cluster analysis findings is we look at the standardized value on the variables that we used in the cluster analysis. So these are the variables that we put into the analysis, and we're looking at patterns of those as they go together. And when individuals exceed plus or minus 0.5 standardized value, that's helpful to us in describing the cluster. And these are just really, for descriptive purposes, the titles of these groups at the bottom. But the first we referred to as our isolate cluster. They had relatively low perceived peer acceptance, along with relatively or very low positive friendship quality and low friendship conflict, suggesting maybe they're really not engaging with peers very much in the setting, which is why we use that term for them. And we had a reject group. This is individuals who were relatively low on peer acceptance and had really a maladaptive friendship profile. Survivors, those who have relatively low peer acceptance, but we'd say an acceptable friendship profile. So they might have a good friend on the team, but generally in the group they're not as accepted. Possibly it's for competence reasons, or there could be a variety of reasons for that. A Thrive group that shows an ideal peer relationship profile where individuals have relatively positive perceptions of peer acceptance along with low perceptions of friendship conflict and tendency toward positive friendship qualities. So this we consider most adaptive, whereas these first three we might consider at risk, particularly these two. And then finally, we call it the alpha profile. They have a nice peer acceptance and positive friendship quality scores, but also a little friendship conflict. So maybe they're a bit domineering in the setting. And again, that's speculative, but this just helps us kind of keep the group straight. And so what we found with these groups was that, in fact, they were discriminable based on the other motivation-related variables. So those who had a more adaptive Thrive profile tended to show qualities that were better for motivation. They enjoy activity more intrinsically motivated, fewer self-presentational concerns, et cetera. So that was very encouraging, but of course, whenever you do this, this is somewhat data-driven. So first question is, can you replicate that? And then secondly, what happens over time? So in other words, remember before I said we're interested in whether this is malleable or not. So we've done another study, not yet published, where we looked at profile membership across a school year. We had a time point around October and another around April. And this was with respect to the general physical activity setting, so this was with middle school students. It wasn't sports specific. And what we found was first that we could, in fact, replicate those profiles. So we saw the same profiles in these data at those two respective time points. And so our question then next was, are they staying in the same profile across the school year, or are they changing? And the way you can tell that is to just look at the diagonal or the off diagonal. If you're on the diagonal, you're in group 1 at time 1 and in group 1 again at time 2. Right? And what you see if you go down to profile change is actually there's quite a bit of changeability. This is not surprising to folks that do peer relationships research or social relationships research. Encouraging maybe that the least change occurs among those who are in an adaptive profile, but still there's a lot of profile change. And so good news, bad news, right? The bad news is moving target. Good news is we can move them, right? If we find the right way to do that. So that's encouraging to us. And I think a good two-barreled strategy could be working to foster more adaptive peer relationships, helping children move to that more adaptive part of the social structure, while simultaneously working on the goal framing that's going on with respect to their peers and others in the setting. And those should really then fuel one another in a very positive direction. So that's one possibility for us down the line. I have some other future research and practice considerations, and again, I can only share selected ones today, but obviously at first is to seek better understanding of the structure and malleability of peer relationships and physical activity. This will require we look at a wider span of peer constructs than we have to date. Look at developmental differences, which will be critical, as well as peer relationship profiles over time. And importantly, the processes underlying change in those profiles. And when we do that, we really need to consider both selection and influence processes. So for young people, they join certain groups or they seek to join certain groups. Those groups may or may not accept them, which is why I have a kind of a permeable boundary here. And then there's some influence potential when you're within the group, right? And so those groups have a quality or a characteristic that changes people, but people move, they hop to groups, right? So we need to consider both of those. And this, there are a variety of types of questions that we can ask. How can we make active groups of peers attractive? Then how can we facilitate entry? So we might have children, we make an active group attractive to them, but then that group rejects them. That's a problem. What are primary mechanisms of influence? How can these mechanisms be optimized and sustained? And how do selection and influence processes intersect with one another? So some additional key considerations. We need to more thoughtfully use ecological perspectives. I think a lot of us have been guilty of citing ecological perspectives so that we can put a whole ton of variables in our study, right? You know, we capture different aspects of those nested components of development. But you know, so we get some environmental constructs, we get some social constructs, some individual constructs, but really ecological perspectives are about the interactions or exchanges among those nested layers of influence. So we do need to work on that. And with respect to peers, we can think about these nested levels of complexity. So there's a peer interaction that I have with Thelma, perhaps, but that's in the context of a relationship, right? We've known each other for a long time. So the way I interact with her might, to an outside observer, look different and be different if I just met you, right? Versus someone that I know for a long time. And then we have to consider that this, of course, exists within a larger group structure. So there's a lot there to untangle, and typically we've not untangled that as yet in our work. Obviously, theory-driven research and practice is desirable. This is not only touted in our field, but you know, in relationship science and developmental psychology, you know, there's a great paper from '93 about peer relations where the author said theory is not a four-letter word, and so we should obviously be following through. And there's plenty of motivation theory we can draw from, as well as relationships theory that we can integrate with that to be helpful here. And of course, we should consider that whether or not we're interested in peer-focused intervention, our interventions oftentimes occur in group contexts. And so when we're promoting activity among young people, we might be missing opportunity to understand why those interventions are effective or not if we aren't looking at the relationships among the individuals in the setting. So those are a few items there, and I hope I've made a case to you that peer-focused physical activity efforts are worth our time. In our efforts to date, we've predominantly focused on the physical activity of peers and their helping behaviors, ignoring the more intimate aspects of relationships that may be more or less powerful with respect to their motivational impact. Moving forward, I believe that theoretically driven and multi-level efforts to better understand how the quality of peer relationships explain intervention effectiveness, how peers flock together, and how peers interact with the broader social and environmental systems for physical activity behavior hold great scientific and applied potential. And most importantly, doing this work places young people at the very center of our concern about their activity and well-being, and I think that's maybe the most important point of all. So thank you very much.